Welcome to Northlandia, a place to bring you curiosity because here you'll find curiosities. I'm Wyatt Buckner with the Duluth News Tribune, and I will be your guide as we discover the unique and fascinating stories here in the Northland. Here we celebrate the region's distinctive people, places, and history. In this episode, we travel north once again on the Iron Range to learn how a children's story inspired the creation of an iconic landmark. Let's venture forth into Northlandia. To share with us the story of Biwabik's Honk the Moose statue, I'm joined again by arts entertainment reporter Jay Gabler. Jay, welcome back.
Thanks, Wyatt. Glad to be here and glad to have journeyed with you to a town that I'm given to understand is actually pronounced Biwabik, although when people start saying it quickly, it starts to sound a lot more like Biwabik.
Yeah, I feel like when you told me that, I feel like that's got to be controversial because I've only ever heard Biwabik. Not that I can recall, but I don't know.
I've only heard Biwabik, but I was born in Minneapolis, so don't count me for having any cred in terms of Iron Range pronunciations.
So Jay, listeners of the podcast will know we're no strangers to talking about statues. We love our Northland statues. If you scroll through our previous episodes, you'll find a few episodes pertaining to statues. Most recently was another Iron Range story. We visited the Chisholm's Iron Man. But now we're talking about a little smaller statue in terms of size and scope with Honk the Moose. So how did you decide to delve into the history of this particular statue?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Wyatt, statues have been mentioned in previous Northlandia features, including Terry Caddo's feature on Northland statues of note. And in that feature, she does mention this Honk the Moose statue, which was thought to be stolen at one point. Turns out it was all just a scheme to raise funds for some necessary repair to the statues. So it was stolen by the mayor. Or someone who served as mayor at one point of Biwabik. Anywho, so I knew of the statue from that feature, and then writing the Best Bets feature, which is something I do weekly at the News Tribune. Recently, I came across the Biwabik festival called Honktoberfest, which is a sort of Bavarian-themed Oktoberfest festival with its mascot being Honk the Moose, this legendary character of Biwabik history. And that started me thinking, what is the backstory of Honk the Moose that he becomes this very prominent character in the lore of this beautiful Iron Range town?
So what is the answer to that question? How did the story of Honk get its start?
It gets its start with a moose. There are a lot of tall tales told about this moose, but it started with an actual moose who wandered into Biwabik in, I understand, 1915. This was referenced in the local newspaper at the time. They made some jokes about the moose perhaps belonging to Teddy Roosevelt's bull moose party and talked about how scraggly the moose was. And, so the truth here is that a moose did wander into Biwabik and was not looking great because it was a tough winter. This, kind of thing happens on the range. And the moose was looking for some food and shelter, which the town had and ended up sharing some of with the moose. So that's how the story of Honk got its start. But that we would not be here talking about Honk if it weren't for a children's book called Honk the Moose, published 20 years after the original moose, who was not at the time named Honk, wandered into Biwabik.
Were you aware of the story previous to gathering the story for this article? I know I've heard the statue, but were you aware of the existence of the children's book ahead of time?
I was not to my memory, and that's a little embarrassing for me because I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the history of children's books and media, and this is a fairly notable children's book, Phil Stong's Honk the Moose. It appeared on at least one fairly prominent list of the best 100 children's books of the 20th century.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it was that well praised.
Yes, it is. It's dated. There are some problematic things about it, but it is also, it's a beautifully illustrated book. The story is really nicely told. I can see where kids would be drawn in by it. So, objectively, a lot of things about this are great. It's a book that you understand why the town is proud of being associated with this book.
Mm-hmm. So who exactly was Phil Stong, the author of the children's book?
So Phil Stong is a guy who became well known as an author. His best known book is actually a novel called State Fair that became the basis for the film musical State Fair. There have been a bunch of different films made using this story and ultimately Rodgers and Hammerstein's original songs. So that's kind of what he's best known for, is writing the original story of State Fair. But when he was in Biwabik, which he was in the late 1910s, 1919 to 1920 is about when he was living and working in Biwabik, he was not yet a famous author. As a matter of fact, he was not yet an author at all. He was a basketball coach. That's what he was doing in Biwabik. He's not from around the area. He is from Iowa, and he would end up dying out east, where he would end up eventually. But he did spend some time living, working on the Iron Range as a basketball coach. And apparently he was at a game, the story is at Ely. The local Biwabik team was playing up there, and he was kind of just sitting on the bench chatting with some of the local youth who were on the team. And they were telling him this story that had happened just a few years back. This is now 1919, 1920. They were reminiscing about this time this moose had wandered into town. And Phil Stong, then the coach, kind of remembers that. That kind of sticks in his head. And so then fast forward now another 15 years later, now it's the mid 1930s, and he is an author, and he decides to write the story of Honk the Moose. And at first I thought, this must be one of those situations where you've got a story that's like just vaguely inspired by real events, like that some version of this actually happened, but then, other than that, it was like pretty, fictionalized. Well, yes, there were some creative liberties taken, but fascinatingly, he ended up populating his book with real people, using the names and likenesses of people who lived in the town at the time of Honk the Moose. We heard about this from Steve Bradach, who had a relative who actually was the storekeeper who's depicted in Honk the Moose, the children's book. You see the moose raiding some vegetables from this storekeeper's supplies. And so Steve Bradach is related to that storekeeper and knows people who are related to plenty of other people in this book. And he explained the basis of these characters.
All the characters in the book, like I said, are real, except for one, the police chief. And that's only because he was an Irishman, and there were no Irishmen in Biwabik at that time.
So what's interesting about that is the last time you were on, Jay, we were talking about, with the Iron Man statue, how the controversy with that at the time was that, people were like, that looks like my grandpa, and it looks like my grandpa, but this book literally is based off of real people, not just some generic iron worker.
Yeah, no, they are real people, and, apparently the descendants of those people are just, proud and pleased as punch to have their family members immortalized in this book. But the book was out of print for a long time. Steve is from the area, and he explained how he became involved in bringing Honk the Moose back into print.
Well, I moved back to Biwabik in 1999, and in 2000, one of the local business owners, Ken Karish, had asked me to consider reprinting the book because one of my family members, my great uncle, he was one of the characters in the book, one of the real characters in the book, and he owned a store downtown called Milner's Store. And I kind of laughed at him at first and said, I don't think this is, I'm not a publisher. Well, so I took it to heart and started digging into it. Found out that there was somebody in Iowa where Phil Stong was born. His name was, I'll have to think about it off the top of my head, but he was a historian in Iowa. And so I called him, and I don't even remember how I got his name, called him, and he knew one of the nieces and nephews of Phil Stong, because Phil Stong never had any children, and gave me the gentleman's name. And I had called the publishing company originally that published the book, and they wanted nothing to do with me. I was too small of a publisher to do this. So I happened to call the nephew, and the nephew said, absolutely, we'd like to reprint the book. And so we reprinted the book. He gave us the rights to do it. We reprinted it, and fortunately, the money that I used to spend to build my wife's cabin, I was able to collect it back by the sale of the books. And my wife's happy, I'm happy, everybody's happy, the book's back in print. So,
did you ever build that cabin?
We did build the cabin, and we live there today.
So through much effort, the book was finally reprinted, but the statue actually went up prior to the reprinting of the book. So how did that all kind of come about?
Yeah, so this is part of Steve and his friends and associates' project to re-elevate Honk the Moose as a character in Biwabik mythology.
We found out that there was some fiberglass moose down in Wisconsin, and there was a manufacturer called Fast that manufactured all kinds of fiberglass statues, probably most of them in the Midwest, and maybe in the US, I don't know. They do a lot of statues. So we contacted them just out of curiosity about getting a moose statue, and of course we had to get approval of the city council to put it in the park because this is a public place. And some people thought, well, we don't want this moose statue in the park because it's going to detract from the park. Others thought it's a great idea, so there were more people that were for it than against it. So we went out to raise some funding, and thanks to the IRRB, Iron Range Resources and Rehabilitation Board, they had a program to donate some money. We had to have matching funds. We set out to sell t-shirts, the city did. We sold t-shirts for years and collected money until we had enough money to buy the fiberglass moose and have it erected here in the park. And it's funny because today, I can't tell you how many times I've driven by and people are pulled up out front here and they're stopping, taking pictures in front of the moose statue. So
that was actually in 2000 when the statue went up. And it was part of decades of efforts to sort of create a new brand for Biwabik, which was historically a core community of the Mesabi Iron Range mining industry. But like the whole range, there had to be some pivots that happened as mining declined as an industry. And in the case of Biwabik, the first thing they did was they introduced some branding kind of associating the town with this Bavarian mountain vibe. So if you drive into Biwabik today, it feels somewhat like you are driving into this sort of charming Bavarian mountain village. You've got sort of German-themed architecture. You do see those beautiful mountains rising, or hills, whatever you would technically want to call the land formations, rising up around town. It is near the Giants Ridge recreation area, which includes skiing and mountain biking and golfing. So it's a great area for outdoor recreation. It definitely does have these alpine vibes. So pretty much when you go to Biwabik today, those are the two brands that you pick up as being associated with town. Is on the one hand, Bavarian Mountain Village, and the other hand, Honk the Moose. Hence, Honktoberfest. See, it all makes sense.
Everything ties back together. And what you described is pretty much very accurate to the area, especially when we drove up there to visit the statue ourselves. It just snowed, so the snow is very fresh up there. And love it or hate it, it looks like with the snow covered, it really does give that mountainous feel to, even though it's not technically a mountain area.
Yes. And you see moose iconography around town. They even have a moose suit in City Hall, I learned, that comes out for Honktoberfest. So they really pride themselves on this history of friendly moose and good skiing. Mm-hmm. And at one point, epic mining.
Yeah. So, Jay, you touched on this earlier in the episode, referring to a theft, or quote unquote theft, of the statue. Listeners of the podcast who are already aware that we love our statue stories are aware that there have been, it seems like thievery is a side subject that seems to always be associated with the statues we talk about in this podcast. The last time Terry Caddo was on here, we joked for a bit about how there just seems to be this constant, this pattern of learning about a statue, and there's just the one or multiple thefts surrounding it. This one's a little bit different, though, as alluded to previously in Terry's original article about statues, and you touched on a little bit here about it was a theft that wasn't really a theft.
Yeah, Steve is still very proud of how he engineered this episode where it seemed to the locals, including the local media, that the statue had been stolen. In fact, it was, so to speak, held ransom for a good cause.
One of these trees had fallen down and cracked one of the antlers. And the only way to repair it was to take it back to the manufacturer, and then they would refiberglass it and repaint it. So we got an estimate for repair, and our local Rotary Club, along with one of the Rotarians, Craig Johnson, who owned the ski shop at Giants Ridge, him and I and my son came down here one evening in the dark and took him and put him on a trailer, stored him in our warehouse south of town here, and then Craig proceeded to take him down to Wisconsin to get repaired. Well, at that point in time, there were a lot of people that said, hey, somebody stole the moose out of the park. So we kind of used it as an opportunity to start to push it to say that he was stolen, and there was a ransom note, and that we needed to collect money and to get him repaired. Somebody stole them, and so people donated money to repair them, and Craig took them down to Wisconsin, and along the way took pictures of them stopping at other moose statues, making fun of the fact that Honk had gone on a road trip to see his brothers and siblings that he hadn't seen in years.
I'm just so surprised that they got away with it, and like I think when the cameras weren't rolling anymore, he had mentioned how I think it was WDIO had reached out to him about asking about the stolen moose, and he didn't want to comment because that would either legitimize this lie, which is not actually stolen, or you'd have to admit that's actually a lie and it is in fact not actually stolen. So that was kind of an interesting little tidbit there.
It's also true of the Honk statue that, well, the illustrations in the book are meant to evoke the actual people who met Honk the Moose, then known as just the Moose, I guess, when he wandered into town. The Honk the Moose statue is maybe not quite as closely modeled after the actual Honk. It's made by this company in Wisconsin that makes a lot of moose statues. You may notice, as Terry noted in her Northlandia feature about statues, a certain resemblance between Honk the Moose, the statue, and the moose statue in Moose Lake, Minnesota. So there's some distinct family resemblance among the moose statues in the upper Midwest, which is fine. I mean, moose kind of look like each other anyway, right?
Yeah, it's true. It's moose is a moose.
Yeah.
So now Honk is back, and it seems like he's not going anywhere. Knock on wood. We are talking about statues here in the Northland, so that's how it seems at least.
Yeah, but Biwabik is doing great as a tourist destination. Giants Ridge is going great guns. People are moving to new housing development, relatively new, built near Giants Ridge, and people are really, proud of this town's identity as just a really cool, distinctive outdoor destination, including a Bavarian mountain vibe, some, good beer throughout the year, and especially during Honktoberfest, and its association with this children's book, Honk the Moose.
Well, the book means a lot to me. I mean, the statue is just an icon for the city of Biwabik, and it's something for people to recognize Biwabik as something, and it's a moose statue, just like a lot of towns have fish and they have other things. And it's another thing, it's just one more piece to bring people to Biwabik. It's just another attraction, and hopefully we continue to grow with more and more festivals and volunteerism, and that's kind of what this is about, is to get people to want to locate here and live in our town and work up here.
So Jay, as a statue in the Northland, it obviously fits our theme of Northlandia, of strange statues within the Northland. But what do you think it is about Honk the Moose that makes it stand out from the rest of the statues that have been mentioned on this podcast previously and just makes it unique?
That's why these statues are such fascinating stories, right? Because every statue is a statue, but every statue has a different reason why it exists, a different kind of thing that it pays tribute to, and a different epic process by which it was funded and constructed. And in the case of Honk the Moose, that is this, original moose from back in 1915 and the highly successful children's book that followed 20 years later. When I was reading Honk the Moose, which I had not read until I started researching this feature, it took me back to my childhood when if I read Honk the Moose, I don't remember reading it, but what I definitely remember are reading books by authors like Robert McCloskey and Ludwig Bemelmans. So Robert McCloskey wrote books like Make Way for Ducklings. Ludwig Bemelmans, of course, the author who invented Madeline. And, as a kid growing up in Minnesota, Make Way for Ducklings totally evoked this world of Boston with these ducks crossing the city to get to this island in this pond in Boston Public Garden. And, if you go there today, I did, as I'm sure thousands and thousands and thousands of people have, you go to Boston Public Garden because you want to see this island where these fictional ducks supposedly made their home. And now there's a statue of the mother duck and all her little ducklings as depicted in the book, although to my knowledge, they weren't based on actual ducks the way that Honk the Moose was. But the point is, the book makes this impression of this place in your mind as a child. And Honk the Moose does the same thing for Biwabik, just like Madeline, the book by Ludwig Bemelmans, and its sequels do for Paris. It, takes you into not just the story of these characters, but this whole universe. And one of the cool things about Honk the Moose is that you can really tell this is not just a guy who drove through town and was like, oh, you had a moose here once? That's a great story. Let me make something up. But it is full of really specific details about everything from the food to the weather to the soil to the culture to the recreation. It's just full of details that really evoke Biwabik as an actual place, especially as it was back in the 1910s. So I think it's just cool that this book exists as a way for, whether or not you decide to share it with your children, given the fact that it does contain some dated ethnic stereotypes. Just going to put that out there. Whether or not this remains a book that is on children's bookshelves, I like that it exists as a sort of document of what Biwabik was like at this place and time as seen through the eyes of these two boys who happened to meet a moose.
All right, Jay. Well, I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much for bringing this here.
Absolutely, Wyatt.
And thank you for joining us on this venture into Northlandia. To read the article for this week's column, as well as see photos and video produced by myself, visit duluthnewstribune.com/topics/Northlandia. You can find all the episodes of Northlandia on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you or someone you know has a unique story that you believe can have a place here in Northlandia, let us know by emailing northlandia@duluthnew's.com. Join us again next week and discover the extraordinary stories that you just might miss if you're on the right place at the right time, ready to step off the beaten path with no rush to return, here in Northlandia.